It's my real pleasure to introduce Sumie Song. She's the Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Green Program, an award-winning experiential education abroad program focused on the world's most pressing sustainable development issues. As the director, Sumie works with universities and oversees corporate engagement and DEI initiatives to promote the development of a diverse workforce in the field of sustainability. She is currently co-chairing NAFSA International Educators Sustainability Special Interest Group. Prior to joining the Green Program, Sumie was an associate professor in the Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences and director of global education at North Park University, where she oversaw study abroad programs and international student and scholar support, helped found the university's Council for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and taught courses on post-colonial criticism, medieval fantasy literature, and self-inquiry. She has a subject matter expertise in institutional planning, assessment of student learning, and accreditation, and for the past 7 years has served on the peer corps of Higher Learning Commission. Sumie's interest is in climate justice issues and she's been focusing this over the past 15 years. Experience at a Chicago-based grassroots organizer who continues to fight with those in her community for housing, health, education, racial and economic equity, and immigration reforms. Sumie has a BA in Comparative Literature from Williams College and a PhD from Duke University in German Studies. Thank you, Sumie, for joining us. I'll hand it over to you for the moderation for our first panel. One last note from my end: we are recording the session. We will be posting it on our YouTube channel. So if you are uncomfortable, we can have our videos. You can have your videos off. But I hope that we will get to see everyone's faces and see who we are talking to. It's not a summit where everyone can be quiet. So please. Whenever you can, it will be nice to see faces as well. Thank you. Sumie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Radhika. It is my honor and privilege to introduce today's opening keynote speakers, Drs. Noah W. Sobe and Aaron Benavot. Dr. Sobe is professor at Loyola University Chicago. From 2019 to 2022, he worked as senior project officer at UNESCO on the Future of Learning and Innovation team, where he helped to lead the research and drafting of the UNESCO flagship report, Reimagining Our Futures Together, a New Social Contract for Education. Professor Sobe is a past president of the Comparative and International Education Society and co-editor of the journal European Education. Aaron Benavot is professor of global education policy at the University at Albany-SUNY, with interests in comparative education research and international education policies. Aaron worked at UNESCO for 8 years, first as senior analyst and then director of the Global Education Monitoring Report, an independent, evidence-based report analyzing progress towards international education targets. Aaron has written extensively about education for sustainable development and global citizenship education, key aspects of SDG Target 4.7, which encapsulates global commitments to transforming education. Aaron also serves as lead of indicator development for the MECCE, a 6-year study on monitoring and evaluating climate communication and education, which seeks to inform intergovernmental negotiations and policy discussions involving climate change education. The title of their presentation this morning is Transforming Towards Utopia, Redefining and Repurposing Change in Global Education. Just a word before we begin on the structure of this session. Dr. Sobe and Benavot will present for about 20 minutes. The next 20 minutes will be dedicated to questions that I will pose to our presenters, and then we will have 20 minutes for discussion, for questions, to take questions from all of you, all of the audience. You are invited to use the chat or raise your hands and ask questions directly of our presenters. And you're welcome to start writing questions in the chat as soon as Dr. Sobe and Benavot have concluded their presentation. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Aaron and Noah.
Thanks so much, Sumie, also Radhika. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining from. Thanks for taking the time out to join the session today. So Aaron and I have been struck by the rise in conversations about transformation. So we want to spend our time today talking about what we see possibly happening and some of its implications. So if you could go to the next slide, Aaron. Great. So as you'll hear in a second, our paper is going to be paying considerable attention to the UN and the work of UNESCO in particular. But we want to start by noting that we sense a shift in language being employed by a number of organizations that are active in global education policy. Here, for example, is a December 2021 piece from the Global Campaign for Education, Transformative Education Meanings and Policy Implications. And we want to start with some proposals for what seems to be at stake in the transformation agenda. So people in education and in the policy world have long recognized the difference between the individual and the social or societal outcomes of education. You know, on the one hand, education has great power to transform lives, right? To open up opportunities, to allow people to escape poverty, to actualize their human rights, to determine their own purposes, and to structure their lives accordingly. On the other hand, we also know that over the last 50 to 70 years, education's been seen as a tool for promoting broader societal objectives, such as economic growth, but also to make societies more fair and make opportunity structures more equitable. So our sense is that we see transformation, being employed to signal something more than immediate or long-term change, something that's more radical, deeper, and systemic. And in one sense, of course, this is clear in the language itself. And one of the common factors converging with transformation arguments is an argument around urgency, particularly the urgency of the contemporary challenges of climate change and environmental degradation, the changes that we're seeing in our oceans, our forests, our rivers, our fields, but also the challenges that racism, exclusion, poverty, and inequality face, present to us. These help to generate, I think, the urgency of calls for radical change. Business as usual is not enough. And one possible consequence that Aaron and I believe we're observing is that the individual and social outcomes of education are being brought closer together. I'm a little bit reminded of a line from Paulo Freire: education does not transform the world, education changes people, people change the world. And while there's great wisdom in this sentiment, I'm not sure that everyone today agrees. Across what we're calling the transformation agenda, there seems to be a very strong conviction that education is world-making, worlds-making, and also that education involves more than human worlds, much more than we were previously aware. So over to you, Aaron, to take us through the next steps.
Thanks very much, Noah. So part of our attempt in some sense beginning an archaeology of this idea of transformative education or transforming education, one can, on the one hand, look at the academic literature, the scholarly journals and books that have been written, and there's much to be seen in how there's been an increased interest in the usage of the term transformation. But in particular for this presentation, and given the subject matter that we're looking at here, we're very much interested in how the global education discourse, or the global discourse around education, has come to embrace this idea of transformative education or transforming education. And I think one of the first places that we can look is a decade ago when the former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon set out an initiative. This was prior to the SDGs, what he called the Education First initiative. And one of the three priority areas was the area of global citizenship. And the quote that I put here is, I think, indicative of a very different kind of a language than we had seen previously, that talks about, as Noah has said, the world faces global challenges that require global solutions. These interconnected global challenges call for far-reaching changes in how we think and act for the dignity of all fellow human beings. It's not enough for education to produce individuals who can read, write, and count. Education must be transformative and bring shared values to life. It must cultivate an active care for the world and for those with whom we share it. Education must also be relevant in answering the big questions of the day. Technical solutions, political regulation, and financial instruments alone cannot achieve sustainable development. It requires transforming the way people think and act. And in a nutshell, that's a very apt kind of opening to the shift in the discourse. The document that we're making reference to was not a document that had any buy-in or support by the international community of nations. It had not been voted upon in the UN, but it was part of an initiative, and an initiative can, in some sense, sow the seeds for changing the way countries view the role of education. And indeed, when you look at the document that nations did have to sign into, which is the document that established the SDGs, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, it uses the word transforming, our word, in the title, but the terms transformative education, transforming education, or even learning were not mentioned at all throughout this kind of document. And perhaps, there's something to be considered here, because this was voted upon not by educational experts, but by representatives, official representatives of the countries, often from ministries of foreign affairs. However, in the international education community, the key document here is the document that they agreed to at Incheon, at the Republic of Korea, and later the framework for action that was agreed upon in November of that year. And here we can begin to see, seeping into the language, the use of the words transforming, transformative, even transformational, occurring a total of 10 times, and keeping in mind that a lot of the drafting of this document was done by international agencies, in particular UNESCO, in conjunction or in consultation with member states. They did have to vote on it, but it was not exactly, it had a feature to it that, of an international document. And then, as Noah made reference to in his own work at UNESCO headquarters, this very important flagship publication that came out 2 years ago about reimagining our futures together, the use of the word transformative is, I wouldn't say ubiquitous, but certainly we see it happening on many, many different occasions. And beyond that, beyond the use of the term, I think it's instructive to see in the last year or two also the willingness to put the notion of transformation or transformative education as a theme or as part of a theme. We see this, for example, in the 5th UNESCO Forum on Transformative Education for Sustainable Development, Global Citizenship, Health and Well-being, and then obviously the 2 summits that occurred last year, the pre-summit in Paris around transforming education, and all of this in conjunction with the UN Secretary General's convening of the Transforming Education Summit in New York, in which this notion of transforming education now has legs and, as it were, roots, and is beginning to structure a lot of the discourse that is very much indicative of this shift. Over to you, Noah.
Thanks very much, Aaron. So, I mean, we're struck when we read the literature by the frequency with which one encounters the notion of transformative education connected to a wide range, maybe a coherent range of curricular content areas and pedagogical approaches. I'm not going to comment on each of these, but we see education for international understanding and peace education, using notions of transformation at the core, human rights education, multicultural education, also quite frequently indexes a notion of transformative learning and education being transformative for the learner. And then, of course, that same sentiment carries through into ESD, education for sustainable development, climate change education, in many instances has a strong transformative element to it. We also see sexuality education, comprehensive sexuality education, health, well-being, and even a really significant concept, in gender equality-oriented work around the notion of gender transformative education. And I'm sure there are people in the meeting today who are quite familiar with that. So, I mean, it's significant, we think, that a lot of these areas of curriculum, are thinking about a particular kind of change making, bringing individuals and social outcomes together, I think. We want to go on to why don't we go to the next slide, Aaron? We want to go on to two examples of recent ways that the transformative and transforming have been put together. And we want to present the argument that the notion of transforming education really seems to be providing a call to action to bring a lot of different players together around a shared objective. So here I want to talk briefly about a second piece released by UNESCO's International Commission on the Futures of Education. So this was a group chaired by the president of Ethiopia, Sahle-Work Zewde, formed in 2019. And then, as Aaron mentioned, and Sumie in the intro as well, released the report, Reimagining Our Futures Together, a new social contract for education in November of 2021. Then, as part of the test, the Transforming Education Summit process, UNESCO was charged with leading, in collaboration with other UN agencies, a pre-summit in advance of the September 2022 New York summit, and decided to reconvene the International Commission in Paris in June to weigh in on and offer some thoughts on the applicability of its report to what the Secretary General was calling for in transforming education. Sorry, I'm hearing some interference. The Commission released a June 2022 two-page document, Transforming Education for Just and Sustainable Futures. And I think it's worth pausing for a second to think about the ways that transformation was conceptualized and defined. The piece begins with a recognition that education has always had to adapt and respond to a changing world, but urges that the education community today recognize that education needs to not just respond, but needs to change the world. And the concept of change that's enlisted is the notion of transformation, right? Fundamental changes to educational processes and opportunities worldwide. The Commission added its own spin. This is less an overturning than a metamorphosis. It issued the call that this be an intergenerational project that leads to something that's both new and a renewal. And I think this next bit of these are quotes from this 2-page piece, which I recommend you look at. Transforming education means going beyond reforms, right, that improve our existing systems and practices. And rather than better visions of existing systems, transformation results in education systems different from today. And I think, our time is limited, but if you look carefully at the UN Secretary General's outcome statement and some of the other documents produced around the test, this notion of education systems different from today, of going beyond reforms, is one of the themes that carries through and is kind of coherent across. I'll finally just mention that this commission's report also speaks of transformative education, defining it as education that empowers as it connects people to each other in the world, exposes them to new possibilities, and strengthens their capacities for critique, dialogue, knowledge creation, and action. All right, over to you, Aaron.
Thanks. So part of the point that we wish to make is that up until now, a lot of the usage of the terms transformative education and transforming education are put onto the page or in various documents and reports without necessarily a clear-cut buy-in or commitment or an explicit vote by representatives, official representatives of governments. And one of the first times in our view that this is going to happen is in the coming months. Some of you are aware of something called the 1974 Recommendation Concerning Education for International Understanding, Cooperation, Peace, and Education Related to Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. This is a very interesting and in some ways prescient document that was established or negotiated in the late 1960s and then eventually voted on in 74. And after, the UN agreed on the 10 SDG targets, and there was an attempt to figure out how to measure target 4.7 that everybody understood to be an important target. One of the things that UNESCO decided to do was to take the commitment that countries that signed on to this recommendation were to report to the international community every several years the evidence or the responses from these survey instruments, then became the means for monitoring progress on target 4.7. The problem is that number one, not all countries, or let's say a very small number of countries, a relatively small proportion of countries, submitted reports in reference to this recommendation. Secondly, most of the evidence that they provide or the responses that they provide are, let's say, self-reported progress. It's very difficult to validate and to get a real sense that progress is being made beyond the words that they place. So in my view, and I've been writing about this, the current monitoring infrastructure based on this recommendation is not really fit for purpose as an instrument for monitoring progress on 4.7. Be that as it may, the interesting thing that has occurred is that UNESCO has embarked on the revision of this recommendation. It's gone through a series of different stages. And what I've taken here are some quotes from the new document. And again, one of the key points is that the notion of transformation and education as a transformative process are strewn throughout this new revised 1974 recommendation. And just so you can see, it's, I've quoted here, persuaded that to shape peaceful, just, equal, equitable, inclusive, healthy, and sustainable societies, education itself must be transformed and expanded for the benefit of all. Among the aims of education, it should be to be transformative, seeking to prepare, motivate, and empower learners to take informed decisions and actions to promote peace, human rights, and such. It's part of the guiding principles embedded in the document, and also in the action areas, both in terms of governance and in teacher preparation or educator development, and even included in terms of part of lifelong learning. So it's clearly a basic kind of foundational dimension of how education is being embedded in this new document. Countries are now in the process of responding and commenting and editing various parts of the text. I would venture to say that when it comes to a vote at the General Conference in the fall of this year, by and large, most of this language would continue to obtain, and that we will see for the first time the international education community, at least in its formal representation at UNESCO, as it were, buying into and embracing this idea of transformation. So this brings us really to the end of our presentation. And I think the insight that Noah and I would like to leave you with is that both of us have been very much informed by the work of a very amazing social historian of American education, David Tyack, and one of his students, Larry Cuban, who wrote, I think, insightfully about how much of the education reforms and ways to transform education in the US are more basically incremental attempts to bring about certain kinds of changes on the edges, and that really deep structures about schooling in the US, what they often refer to the grammar of schooling, don't change very easily and often are immune to many of the reform waves over the course of decades, right? And so what we see, or what we would like to characterize, is that much of the global discourse has also had this aspect of tinkering, or at least trying to bring about change, but more on the edges, because much of the infrastructure of education worldwide is fairly well instantiated or established. And that this new terminology, and in some ways it doesn't make a difference if you use the word transformative education as a way of encapsulating many of the different curricular content that Noah made reference to, or if you use the more active call for action by using the term transforming education, both of these in some deep sense really talk about moving much more deeply toward a utopian vision in an active way, in a more comprehensive way, and that education needs to be mobilized as a driver of this transformation. And for us, that is the crux of the kind of the change that's occurring in the last 5 years. And I can only end by saying personally, that having worked, at UNESCO headquarters for quite a few years, and I left in 2017, if you had asked me at that point, would there ever be an international education summit that would use the term transforming education in its title within a few years afterwards, I would have said, this just inconceivable that this would occur. And yet, partly due to the pandemic, partly due to the urgency around the global challenges, that indeed has become the language. And whether or not it brings about the kinds of changes that are envisioned is another issue, but certainly the language and the intentions and the policy kind of main policy documents have put forth these kinds of arguments. So with that, I think I will stop sharing my screen, and we're delighted to invite our moderator to ask her questions.
Thank you, Aaron and Noah. This is fascinating and also encouraging. Especially encouraging, I found, is the inclusion of a call for education to be transformative, to be transformational in the UNESCO revisions. And that they mentioned things like teacher education and lifelong learning. So I have several questions for you. I would love to hear from you, what for you does a fundamentally transformed system of education look like? Can you offer examples of, can you speak specifically to the types of systemic structural transformations that you imagine, that you envision, especially as they relate to your respective areas of interest and research?
Sure, thanks, Sumie. I can start off quickly. I think one of the key things we need to all be attentive to is the question of transformation towards what, right? I think we need to ensure that amidst all this talk about transformative and transforming, we work together to build clear consensus on the directions we want to head. And I would say one of the key things we need to do is ensure that education moves away from current practices of competition, selection, and a narrowing of opportunities towards recognizing the abundance, right, that's in our world, the abundance that's knowledge, that's the global knowledge commons, that's the very process of learning. So, you know, tied to that, I think we need to ensure that education moves from being, you know, a private good, a market good, towards being a really robust common good. So I think that the major transformations we need to make are to ensure that schools, other educational institutions are not places of competition for scarce opportunities, right? You know, that they broadly distribute knowledge and expertise and not concentrated in the hands of the few, right? And there you probably caught me going right back to the Ban Ki-moon sentiment that Aaron opened with. Aaron?
Yeah, I would suggest two possible ways to think about this. One is how the education systems position themselves vis-a-vis the external environment in which they are embedded. And we should all be aware of the fact that most education systems are national education systems. In other words, they're creations of nation states that have very particular purposes, that have very particular priorities, economic, political, cultural, and otherwise. And yet, we, all of us now understand that for the education to be a driver of fundamental change, it needs to go beyond thinking only in terms of the national priorities, but to think about issues that transcend national boundaries, that speak to regional priorities, international, global challenges. And so the question is, you know, is the education system up to it, you know, especially given the very heavy hand of national governments in determining what gets taught and how it gets taught and how teachers are prepared and so on and so forth. So I think that's one way, is to think about, you know, it's the repurposing, reimagining to what purposes, what Noah talks about, but especially transcending this long historical kind of national embeddedness of the education system. The other point that I would make, I would say, is more relevant to how we conceive education as a lifelong and life-wide process. So, you know, when we talk about transforming education, by and large, most people think we're talking about transforming formal education institutions, be they, you know, early childhood or primary, secondary, post-secondary, higher education, rather than thinking of the multitude of ways in which people are learning throughout their lives, young people, middle-aged, older people, in all the many spaces, non-formal, informal, and to begin to conceive of that wide-ranging learning opportunities that go beyond what happens in schools and universities between the ages of 5 to 25, but rather from 5 to 85, you know, kind of the entire scope of one's life in many different respects, and trying to try to think more systematically how, you know, what are the multitude of pathways in which people move from formal, non-formal back again throughout their lives in a very seamless way. But our models and our understandings and the way in which we develop policy is very much inhibited by the fact that we have so little information about the ways in which people do learn outside the formal system. We have this incredibly elaborate structures to help us to know in precise details how many kids are in school or out of school, and how many kids, you know, young people are learning or not learning, and, you know, gauging all that, and even in universities. But all the other ways in which people are enriching their lives and being informed by what goes on in the world for better or for worse, we have very little idea. It's mostly invisible. So for me, a real transformation would change the way in which we think about the broader scope of education and learning beyond formal institutions.
Thank you so much. When we first met, when the three of us met, I had shared an example from Finland in response to, the work that you had just talked about, your work in the area of lifelong education. And, as we know, many of the Nordic countries, they rank very highly on this sort of happiness, factor. And in Finland, they explored the role, the very sort of critical role that access to learning, lifelong learning, in community centers, I guess you would call them. We don't really have the equivalent here in the US. They found that this is a space in which the generations, there was intergenerational sort of interaction, deep sort of interaction and connection, but that people could, throughout the course of their lives, take courses in sort of anything that may have sparked their interest or even, identified, oh, I might be interested in this. So I think that what struck me, about this sort of discovery, it was a discovery for me, is that this is a system, a nation state, as it were, that's really prioritized human development over, sort of economic growth at all costs, right? So this segues into my next question. What do you both see as the greatest obstacles to the types of transformation that you, that indeed many of us who are present here today want to see happen, that we dare to imagine? What needs to be transformed most in order for transformation to happen, to enable true, sustainable transformation?
Should I start?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks. That's a great example, Sumie, and I really appreciate the question. I am of the mind that we can really only change how we do education when we change why we're doing education. And for me, that's where going to some of the grammar of schooling arguments and the David Tyack notion of tinkering towards utopia and thinking now about a transforming towards utopia model, they're useful because, all of us know, like, schools can feel, and other educational institutions can feel like they're difficult to change. I actually think they change. The historian, I think they change more over time than we sometimes recognize. But one of the points that people who study the grammar of schooling, or then there's other concepts, la forme scolaire, other ways people have conceptualized this, but one of the useful ones is this idea that schooling needs to be both doable and worth doing, right? It needs to be like bureaucratically, organizationally possible, right? And there needs to be some larger purpose that makes it worth doing. And I think that for much of let's say the second half of the 19th and much of the 20th century, in many parts of that world, it's been the ideal of meritocracy, right? That's made schooling worth doing. And that's what's backed the organization of schools as these places of parceled out opportunities, as these places of competition. So I think we need a fundamental shift from meritocratic ideals towards a different set of values. And I think, clearly we, what in some sense, the beauty, and I'll just close with this, the beauty of meritocracy, right, is that it recognized that in our societies, in modern societies, we need highly specialized expertise and we need highly competent leadership, right? We still need those things. We just need them to be much more broadly distributed, right? And we need schools to open that up as opposed to close that up. So I think changing why we're doing schooling is the key piece to changing how we're doing it. Over to you, Aaron.
So I would again make 2 points, and I don't want to take too much time because I know there's some questions out there that also we should respond to. The Finnish example is also instructive as how Finland brought about its fundamental education reform. And, the Finnish leadership decided to really mobilize all key kind of stakeholders in Finland to engage in a fairly extensive conversation about what would be the vision of an education system that you want to work toward. And it was only after there was a sense of consensus, even among people who perhaps had very opposing or conflicting ideas, and that a reform was actually instigated and established. And in some ways, that is part of the secret potion to the success of Finland, is that once you were able to, somehow get a multi-stakeholder buy-in about a reform that, civil society, business, the government, different parties in the government, all kind of signed off on the nature of the reform, then it was much less a reflection of this party that's in power, this party that's in power. And the reform, really had some long-term impact, because many of these reforms, to really have an impact, take time, to both be established and be implemented, and have the kind of, that teachers are informed, and school principals and headmasters and whatnot. So short-term reforms are probably not going to get us too far, and they are more tinkering rather than transformational. So that's one part of it. The other part, and it really speaks, I think, a little bit to the other point that I made earlier, for me, until we make visible the multitude of ways in which people learn that we don't know about, that are currently invisible, until we kind of retool the way that we measure, report, and monitor educational progress in a much broader way than we do now, I have a feeling we're not going to get too far, because the things that count are often not being counted. The things that do make a difference, we have a hard time measuring, and therefore they become deprioritized by virtue of the fact that we don't have some systematic evidence to engage in a conversation around that, which is a real pity. And that's one of the reasons that I have been, working really hard to figure out ways, innovative ways to, measure and monitor Target 4.7 and things related to climate change education, because they are consequential and we need to be innovative. And I don't necessarily think the current infrastructure is going to get us very far. So we have to think outside the box. So for me, that's a major obstacle that needs to be addressed until we can have some real transformative education.
Thank you.
Can I just come in real quick?
Of course, yeah.
On the, just to say, I agree with Aaron fully. We've teased each other about whether the dog wags its tail or the tail wags its dog, but we both agree we like dogs with tails. So, and at heart is kind of a conversation about purposes. I just want to say, that there's a UK organization, Big Change, that's doing really good work on this. And I think what Aaron's describing is the same sentiment that's embedded in the International Commission on the Futures of Education's call for a new social contract for education. Right. Sorry, just wanted to throw that in. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to open it up now. We have a series of really great questions. So the first, how can education transformation be more understandable by regional level and country level to integrate it to a country's, a nation state's educational curriculum and curricular policies?
So I'm just going to say a brief comment. I always go back to the synthesis document that the UN Secretary General put together in December 2014, just before the SDG agenda was put forward. And he made it very clear at that point that, for example, there could be, there should be a kind of a series of indicators at the local level, at the national level, at the regional level, at the global level. So, and these don't necessarily have to all say the same thing. Part of what would need to happen would be a kind of contextualization or an attempt by different regional groups to kind of agree on a particular set of priorities and move forward with those. So I think it's enormously important that people see that there is legitimacy even in these global documents that, kind of provide the basic foundation for a lot of this movement. There is opening for this idea that there are multiple levels. We're not talking about isomorphism here. We're not talking about everybody has to get in the same boat. There needs to be a commitment, to drive the agenda forward, but the ways in which that commitment kind of become meaningful in a local or national or regional setting could be actually quite different and should be.
Thank you. Yes, Noah.
No. We can go on to the next question.
Okay. What are some tangible changes that you think should be made in today's classroom? So if you walked into a middle school classroom today, what would you like to see and hear happening while we wait for policies and the curricula to change? What can teachers do now in the here and now today?
I'll start off. I think one of the most concrete things we can do is teach children about connections rather than categories. When you think about all the work, we don't need to pull the slide up again, but the examples of transformative education, that we gave earlier, often resonate with calls for interdisciplinary, intercultural, ecological approaches, to learning in formal and outside of formal education. And I think that what brings those together most clearly is the invitation to think about connections rather than categories. And that leverage, right, that comes from understanding relationships and interconnections and interdependencies, also dependencies, that's going to give people the critical leverage to bring transformative change into the world.
Quickly, I would say there needs to be, we need to undermine the incredible, powerful, summative, high stakes assessments that drive so much of what goes on in classrooms, that cast a long shadow, even if they take place at the end of secondary education, they can have an impact down to kindergarten and first grade. So that would be one thing, would be to undermine the authority and power and consequences of such assessments. Secondly, I would restructure the way that cultural content is embedded in schools. I don't think that you can have a 45-minute, kind of period in which to kind of cut, slice and dice the content. One of the interesting features of the Finnish system is they tend to have longer periods of like 90 minutes in which more than one teacher work together around a project that incorporates multiple kind of knowledge domains together, so that knowledge is seen as more integrated and more interdisciplinary, and there's a greater amount of time set aside for kind of deeper learning. I think those are all kind of critical elements. And certainly, I do think we need to empower teachers to be more, that they need to have some tools to do more formative assessments in the ways in which they can support, especially learners who come with fewer resources, and that whether it be in terms of language or whatever might be some of the barriers that certain learners face, they need to be able to figure out what they can do in the confines of the school to support some of the weakest or most challenged learners.
Thank you so much. Stacy Alvarez de la Campa, you had a question. Would you like to ask it directly?
Sure. Thanks very much. It's great
Of
to be
course.
here. This is very exciting to join. So I'm based in Barbados, and I have a question regarding the whole concept of foundational education, because I'm currently writing an article to submit to NORAG about foundational learning and foundational education, traditionally only encompassing basic numeracy and literacy. But I think it's really important, even in terms of climate change education and a connection to the environment and a holistic view of us becoming part of this world and our community, to include aspects of climate change education at a foundational level, because children, it's so easy for us to look down on what they encompass in their inner world and their inner lives and what they do. But some of the most magical people in the world are children, and education, I think, should seek to hone that intuitive connection to the environment, which also reflects a lot of traditional or indigenous beliefs about education and our connection to the world. So to what extent do you think we should include that idea of climate change education and the environmental learning in foundational education, more than just numeracy and literacy. Thanks for the opportunity to ask the question.
Of course.
Go ahead, Noah.
I mean, I'm fully on board with you, Stacy. I mean, I honestly think it's a myth that, foundational education, needs to be done in this isolated way, that you can teach literacy and numeracy without any connection to the world, life's problems. I think we probably agree that climate change education is not a luxury or an add-on. I fully believe it can be deeply integrated into fundamental learning, literacy and numeracy, which again, I think can't be done without practice and application. Otherwise, it's an empty exercise, and we're all way more than ChatGPT bots.
Yeah, I think that there are quite a few people that see this as a zero-sum game, which is very unfortunate.
Yeah.
And potentially it's both from the donor side and maybe those who receive donor funding, that they feel an acute kind of uneasiness because of the prioritization given foundational learning. But I think one should really resist the call to see it as conflictual. And as Noah says, I think there are many ways to integrate a much broader transformative curriculum and at the same time teach and deepen foundational skills and other 21st century skills. I mean, both basic skills and others that are very relevant to the 21st century. So yeah, we need to rewrite textbooks so they can help teachers. We need to, prepare teachers to be able to find ways to do this kind of integration. It's not seamless. It's not self-evident necessarily. And so teacher training programs, teacher preparation needs to help in that regard. And one would hope that you could reach out to parents and they would understand how this is also valuable in a way that is, because of the substance is being integrated, or certain kind of substantive issues are being integrated in the ways in which young people acquire the foundational skills. So it's important to think about them also as an important constituency here in driving home this point.
Wonderful. Thank you. Are there any other global thought leaders that are taking on the heavy lift of global educational innovation, similar to what Esther Duflo and Amarjit Banerjee are doing? I don't know if you're familiar with those folks. I am not. I apologize.
You want to start, Noah?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not sure what I don't want to impute intent or to the question. I think it's dangerous if we chase the latest idea. I mean, I do appreciate the examples that have been drawn from Finland, but I also think it's dangerous if we chase, Finland. I would just echo what Aaron said earlier in response to the question, how do we take transforming education systems and transformative education agenda forward at regional and country levels? It's going to depend, right? And it shouldn't all look the same, right? And I think the first step is a conversation about directions that need to be headed, and building consensus and building groups. So I think there's endless lists of organizations and people doing amazing work. And they're probably closer at hand than some of us realize. Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, as I understand the reference to the two colleagues, at MIT, and the work that they've been doing in trying to develop, randomized experiments to test, different kinds of policy interventions that obviously has a lot of, is considered, quote unquote, the gold standard in terms of the evidence that's used to drive policymaking in some circles. I wonder when it comes to some of the issues that are embedded in Target 4.7, how easy it is to drive home a particular policy intervention and randomly assign, students to different kinds of things. It's a very expensive adventure, and I'm not sure that both some of the member states or countries that are embracing this would see it as a good investment. And since it deals with issues of more, moral character and ethics and, kind of worldviews, these are not easily kind of equated with like a policy that's meant to be more or less effective, but rather, again, what are the ultimate purposes of the education that's being provided? And even if it's doing, could do a better job or a less better job based on some kind of evidence, it's a little bit beside the point. If indeed the community has agreed on a very particular direction that is about its own understanding of itself, its collective identity, the purposes at which it wishes the schools to reach out to, and how they go about doing that. So I'm reluctant to kind of say, well, the only way to get this to happen is by doing, very well-controlled, randomized controlled experiments and testing certain, derivatives of target 4.7 or such things.
Thank you. This is our last question. I'll try to read it really quickly. I don't know if you'll be able to answer it as quickly. In the US, our education and other systems reinforce a separation of people by age. Is there an example of or a connection to this vision of lifelong learning and abundance that could break down and address some of these intergenerational silos?
It's one of these forms of the grammars of schooling that are not easily, the 1930s brought about the standardization of schooling, and much of that standardization had to do with age grading and bringing, separating kids by the moment that they came into the world. And, there are obviously some private forms of education, the Montessori system and others, at some of the early levels that allow for multi-age school classrooms. And in certain parts of the world, we have multi-age classrooms by fiat, because there aren't so many kids in each cohort, so they do learn together. I think we all believe, and I'm not sure of the evidence about this, that when older children are given the opportunity to interact with younger children and teach them, that they themselves gain a lot of self-confidence and other very important aspects of social emotional learning. So I think the point is well taken. The question is, how do you actualize it in a system that is fairly rigid around some of these issues and only becomes less rigid under very particular constraining factors? And just one final comment, that even though I've just now stated how rigid it is, one of the things that we've learned through the pandemic is some of the things that we thought were the most rigid and less susceptible to any kind of change actually did change. So, maybe there are openings here that we need to think about and bless, or at least suggest.
Noah?
I agree. I think Aaron put it well. We need to open up educational opportunities at all levels. I would say, let's just embrace education as an intergenerational project, that, in which kind of the young come into the world and the old are rejuvenated.
I want to thank you both so much. Thank you for your work and your time this morning. And I've learned so much. This has been educational and transformative and transformational, and has given me a lot of hope. I wanted to know, some people have asked for your emails. If someone wants to address a question to you, or if their question was not asked, will you welcome emails from them? Okay, great. Thank you so much again. And I will turn it back to Radhika.
Thank you, Sumie.
Thanks a lot, Sumie. Thanks for all the questions too.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sumie. That was wonderful. Great start of the day. I want to turn it over to Sonia to